Good morning. Um, Man, this is the short week is interesting. It's like, whoa, that's it. We go. See you later. It was nice knowing you. Um, it was such a joy getting to talk to several of you throughout the last few days, and just you've been so kind to my family, to my kids, and to my mom, and hearing, the greatest thing has been hearing some of your stories and some of the ways in which things that have been happening or stories that have been told throughout our few days together have resonated with you, how God has maybe spoken to you and encouraged you. And I hope more than anything, you sense that you're not alone. I get that sense when I talk to you. Several of you have told me, man, when you said this, or when Jim said this, or when the band played this song, it just clicked for me. Like, that's exactly how I feel. Or those were the words that, you put words to the thing that was kind of, bubbling up inside of me. And one of the great gifts of an experience like that, I've had many experiences like that as well, have had them here in the last few days. One of the great gifts is that it's God, again, God sort of whispering to us, hey, you're not alone, you're okay. I see you, I'm with you, and there are others who see you and are with you, and in some small way get a bit of what you're going through. So I hope as we sort of trek down from this mountain this afternoon, we have that sense that we're not alone. I got a chance to share with the staff here, the amazing staff here, a couple days ago, I think. And this is not in my notes, not a part of what I wanted to share today, but I just felt compelled to share this with you. I told the staff, and I think this is so true for them, but I think it's true for all of us. If you read the scriptures, if you go into the Bible and read the Bible, there are many stories of people going up mountains, and every single time those folks come down the mountain at some point. Here's what's really interesting. No one ever goes up a mountain and comes back down the mountain the same in the Bible. No one. Not a single person. Every time someone ascends a mountain, they come back down from that mountain changed. They're different. And that difference makes all the difference for the rest of their days, actually. And I grew up, I have a real heart for camping ministry as well. Many of us do, because I grew up going to summer camps and winter camps, and my life was also changed. I encountered the risen Christ in some really meaningful ways at camp. And then in my late teens, basically my freshman to junior year of college, I went through what is now very sadly a common sort of deconstruction of faith season of my life, where I went to college and I went and read like 10 pages of a philosophy book and thought I was the smartest person on the planet. That's what happens when you're 18. And I just deconstructed 2,000 years of Christianity after 10 pages of a philosophy book. I was like, oh, I know better than 2,000 years of Christian history. And I was like, that was all a joke, this whole sort of youth group experience and all the camp highs I had, those were all a facade. They were a lie sort of built on the wobbly stilts of religion or whatever. I did that whole thing. And now in my early 40s, I have come full circle where I've come to realize actually that that was the lie when I was 18, 19. This belief that what happens up on the mountain and what you sense and what you feel and the sort of strong sense of God's presence in your life and the way he is moving in you and in your family and maybe even in your children, that's all sort of camp high emotionalism, and reality is when you go back down to the grind of the 9 to 5. That's real, and all of this is just sort of emotionalism. That's what I believed when I was 18 or 19. What I've come to realize now is actually, the great enemy of God, his name is Hasatan, the Satan, right? It's not a name, it's not a proper name, it means the deceiver. His nature is to lie. Jesus calls him the father of all lies. What I realize now is that when I was 18 or 19, the devil, God's great enemy, the Satan, the liar, What he did to me, as he does to so many of us and so many people worldwide, is he began to whisper these lies to me. And one of the great lies was that these moments where we have clarity of God, like God's presence, his voice, his love, his compassion, his grace in our lives, as many of us have had up on this mountain, the devil will lie to you and say that's all emotionalism. And the sort of grind and the cynicism of your daily life, that's reality. And it is one of the great lies of the enemy. What you sense in the clarity of a place like Mount Hermon, when you remove the distractions and open your heart and mind to the possibility that the God of the universe might actually be talking to you, in those moments, what you sense, what you have experienced, maybe what your kids have experienced in the last few days, this is reality. And when you go back down to your everyday, ordinary, regular life, the enemy will begin lying to you. It's like, well, Mount Hermon is just a 1-week thing every summer. It's like, this is reality, dude. This, just God doesn't speak that clearly. Does God even really, is he really involved in the everyday, rhythms of your life? I mean, that's Mount Hermon stuff, but come on, right? Let's snap back, in the words of the theologian Eminem, snap back to reality, right? But that's a lie. That's a lie. The same God that has felt so close for so many of us the last few days, he wants to be just as close, if not closer, to you in the midst of the grind, in the midst of the ordinary, in the midst of the jar of clay that is your life. And that should lead us to immense joy. There's a pastor in Washington, D.C., his name's Mark Batterson. He's the first person that I heard sort of use this phrase. It's really helpful for me. He talks about the myth of when, then. So the myth goes like this: when I have, fill in the blank, or when I achieve, fill in the blank, or when I'm back at Mount Hermon next summer, or when whatever, then I will be fulfilled. I'll be full of joy. I'll experience meaning and significance and purpose and the love of God in a deep way. When this happens, or when I have this, then I will experience life and life to the full. And he calls that a lie, and it is a lie. It's a myth. Last night, Jim talked about thankfulness being an attitude that transcends circumstances. I love that thought. In fact, that's kind of where we're going to go this morning. And he talked about, Johnny Erickson Tata, who's been at our church, like he said, incredible, one of the most fascinating and profoundly wonderful, beautiful, godly people you will ever meet. And how she talked about thankfulness, gratitude as a reflexive reaction, right? A reflex reaction. That becomes the natural sort of centered posture of your life at all times. This is one of the best ways to fight against the lie of when, then. There is no when it comes to joy and purpose and meaning and God's presence and his love for you. There is no when. That is all accessible to you right now. And specifically, I've watched you these last few days. You have had so many moments of joy. I've seen so many smiles, so much laughter up here. In fact, think about it this way. I don't know what part of the country you live in, but where I live, in the heart of Silicon Valley, people are way too busy to smile at each other. People are too busy to even look at each other. And I'm not judging others. This is self-indictment. This is me too. Some of you have experienced me here for the last 3 days, and you think like, oh, Jay, he's kind of a nice guy. If you were to see me back home, as many of this crew right here from Westgate see me back home, a couple of them see me in the office 5 days a week, they would tell you, he's not that nice and smiley all the time. I'm too busy. I don't have time to smile at you. I don't have time. But up here, I'm like, it's like peaceful and serene and so wonderful, right? But when I get back to the grind, I'm just like, go, 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 because that's the rhythm of where I live. And my guess is that that's probably the rhythm of where you live. We get so inundated with the treadmill of achievement. We don't have time to live the way we live here for a few days, you know? In fact, there was he's not a Christian, but he's a British psychologist named Michael Asink. And in the 90s, he coined this term, the hedonic treadmill. The hedonic treadmill, which I think is really fascinating. The hedonic treadmill, meaning hedonic, do you have that image? I think we have an image of the hedonic. No, go way back, that's later. It's a bunch of pictures of Jesus. Is that not in there? It's just a dude on a treadmill? Oh, it's not in there. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. Imagine a treadmill. You all know what treadmills are like. He called it a hedonic treadmill, hedonic meaning hedonism. And what is hedonism? That's pleasure, right? It's like the unabashed, relentless pursuit of pleasure. That's hedonism. And Michael Asink, the psychologist, he said people in the modern Western world, you and me, we live life on a hedonic treadmill. And what is a treadmill? I just ran on the treadmill here yesterday morning. What is a treadmill? You are constantly moving, but you're never going anywhere, right? Now that's fine if it's just for exercise, but that is no way to live your life. But Asink, this secular British psychologist, called it a hedonic treadmill because he said what most modern people in the industrialized world do is they spend the entirety of their lives constantly chasing pleasure, hedonism. Like, I want to feel good. If you go to a bookstore, you know where the largest section of any bookstore is? It's the self-help section. In the last 30 years, self-help books have outsold all other books, like by a very wide margin. In fact, Jim could tell you this because he's authored, I don't know how many books, many books, and he could tell you this. I could tell you this as well. When you sign with a book publisher, one of the questions they will ask you, regardless of the idea that you're putting out there in the book, they will ask, and this is a good question, they will ask you the question, okay, well, how does this actually help people? Like, how do we title it where the person can read the title and immediately know this will help me? That's not a bad thing, but it can get dangerous if life becomes not just about I need help to nurture my family or my marriage. That's a really good thing. It's a godly thing. But I mean, go to the self-help section of any bookstore. It's like anything you could think of in life, right? It's like success, wealth, you know, like achieving the C-suite in your company, whatever. There's a self-help book for it. In fact, there's 24 self-help books for it. It's because we live on a hedonic treadmill. We are constantly chasing what feels good, what feels better. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the imagery is important. Because ultimately, if pleasure and good feelings are the thing you are after, you will find yourself constantly chasing, never arriving. Why? Because pleasure and feeling good is not joy. And what the human soul longs for is not actually pleasure. What your soul deeply desires is joy. This is why Jim said yesterday, thankfulness is a posture you can have despite circumstances. What else did he say? I thought it was so profound. You can't change your circumstances, but you can change your attitude. And that makes all the difference. This is how joy works. Gratitude, thankfulness is it's a significant part of that change. Like you have such little control over the circumstances and situations that you are returning to this afternoon. I mean, you've got some control, but honestly, you have such little control. The things that are most painful in your life, think about them right now. I know you don't want to. You're like, this is my last day at Mount Hermon, dude. Don't make me think about that stuff. Just think about it for a few seconds. The things that are most painful. Maybe it's a break in a relationship. Maybe it's a family situation that's just like gut-wrenching and heartbreaking for you. Maybe it's a longing or a desire. You've been praying that God would fulfill this longing, this good longing and desire for years, and he has not yet. Maybe it's a job situation or a career situation or some financial pressure or whatever it might be. Think about that thing. Now, think about how much control you have over that situation. Probably almost none. Because if you had control, it wouldn't be a painful situation. If you could control it, you would have fixed it yesterday. You have very little control. So you are resigned to one of two options. One, you can just run the treadmill. You can essentially medicate from the pain of your circumstances by seeking pleasure, right? A lot of people do this. Jim talked about his father being an alcoholic. We have so many similarities. My dad, who I did not know, was an alcoholic for most of his life. What was he doing? I don't even know the man. I didn't know the man. He passed away 10, 11 years ago. I didn't really know him. But what was he doing? Without even knowing his story, here's what I know. He was medicating from the pain of his circumstances. He just wanted to feel good. His situation, his circumstances were really hard. He had lost his family because of his own doing. He had created an untenable situation for my mother and for me as a newborn. And out of safety reasons, we had to leave. So he had created a situation because of his own addictions and all sorts of other things. But what did he do? He kept drinking. Why? Because though he could not control the circumstances and situations of his broken life, he could at least feel good for a while. That's the hedonic treadmill. What my father lacked until the last few years of his life, actually, what he lacked was an understanding of joy. Because joy is not primarily about pursuing pleasure. Joy is not like this spark. You know, Eysenck, the psychologist, he called it the hedonic treadmill because he said that pleasure, it's deceptive. You're running on a treadmill because the way pleasure works is the moment you get the thing you think will be so pleasing, it's no longer as pleasing. Those of you with young children, this happens all the time, right? It happens for me all the time. How often have I had like my son or my daughter just, Dad, I just want this one toy. I'll just give you a good example. My kids are obsessed with Bluey right now. Anybody? Anyone with me? Yeah, okay. Bluey's actually pretty awesome. So my son, he got some money. He got some money for his birthday. He saved up that money. And we're like, okay, dude, like, let's go to the store and you get to pick. You can pick a toy for yourself and you can get a toy for your sister, you know? So he goes around and he's got X amount of dollars he can spend and he picks like this set of toys, like Spider-Man toys, and then he sees Bluey, this little like cute stuffy Bluey that you can squeeze, and he says all the Bluey lines. And dude, he was like, this is it. This is the holy grail of toys. This is the only thing I need in life, you know? And it was like a little over his total amount. So he's like, please, Dad, please. And we're like, okay, fine. It's Bluey. You love him. We buy it. He's just over the moon. He's like squeezing it the entire way home. It was a 10-minute drive home. We get home. We get into the house. He plays with this thing for maybe another 10 minutes. And then I just see it laying on the floor. I mean, literally half an hour ago, my boy was like, I need nothing else in life but this Bluey toy. And the moment he got it, he played with it for a while, less than an hour. And he's like, it's all right. It no longer brought him the pleasure it brought him literally an hour before. This never changes. This is always how it works. It's why it's a treadmill. The things that feel good don't always feel good. This is why my father spiraled into addiction, because 2 drinks felt great at first, but now 2 drinks did nothing, not even a light buzz. So then it goes to 4 drinks, and then to 6, and then to hard liquor, and on and on and on until the body caves and you die. That's what happened to my dad. This is what happens to all of us, because pleasure is not joy. It is fleeting. You guys remember Marie Kondo? She's not really around that much anymore. Does anybody remember Marie Kondo? Like, oh, whoa, tons of you. Any of you guys fold your laundry the Kondo way? Just don't be shy. Yes, my wife does too. She swears by it. I think she's in a cult, to be honest. It's kind of weird. What did Marie Kondo, if you don't know who Marie Kondo is, she's this like 5'0" Japanese woman who is a multi-gazillionaire, all from tidying up. She's an organizer. She had Netflix shows and best-selling books, all this stuff. And she has a line that basically launched her into superstardom. You know what the line was? It is what sparks joy. So Marie Kondo, the Kondo way would be when you tidy up your house, when you achieve sort of minimalism, you look through everything in the clutter and the mess of your life, and you grab a thing and you ask yourself, this old t-shirt, does it spark joy? And if it doesn't, you discard it. That's what she said. Now, it's a wonderful way to tidy up your house. It's a wonderful way to get rid of old clothes, right? But it gets very dangerous because most Americans in particular ask that question of everything in life. Having been a pastor for 20 years, I have had far too many pastoral counseling sessions with couples whose marriages are on the rocks. And they don't usually use these specific words, but 99.9% of the time, you know what the reason is? Essentially, they're saying of one another, you know what? She doesn't really spark joy for me anymore. So kind of like an old pair of underwear, I'd like to discard her. Like, he doesn't really spark joy for me anymore. But you know what? That man over there, he kind of does. So I'd like to move on from this and move on to that. That's almost always what happens. This is really dangerous. This is, again, the hedonic treadmill. We just keep chasing the thing that feels good. But sparks are not joy. So what is joy? In the Old Testament, there are several Hebrew words for joy, but the most common Hebrew word is the Hebrew word simcha. So let me just show you a few examples of this. Most commonly, the word simcha refers to a person's state of being when they are specifically in connection to God. Really interesting. A couple of examples. Psalm 16:11. In your presence, in God's presence, there is fullness of joy. Or Psalm 30, you, God, turned my wailing into dancing. You removed my sackcloth and clothed me with joy. The word simcha also refers to God's posture. This is really important. God's posture toward his people and his creation. Psalm 104, the Lord rejoices, or may the Lord rejoice in his works. Or Zephaniah 3, the Lord your God is in your midst, a warrior who gives victory. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will renew you in his love. He will exult over you with loud singing. This is joy. It's very relational. It's not about the thing that feels good. In the Bible, at least in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, joy is almost always what we experience when we are in nearness to God. Joy is not about when we have X, Y, and Z. Joy is, for the Christian, about who we are near. Live near to God, and there is joy in his presence because he rejoices over you. And then when you go to the New Testament, the most common word for joy in the New Testament Greek is the word chara. And it's actually deeply connected to the word for grace, charis. And it is often in the New Testament, joy is it's an internal attribute. a consistent attribute of someone whose life is full of God's Spirit. Again, nearness to God. So, famous example, Galatians 5, right? The fruit of the Spirit is what? Love, joy. The fruit of the Spirit, not what you muster up with your own strength, but the fruit of God's Spirit working in and through you is love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, and on and on. It's also, as Jim mentioned last night so beautifully, it's not contingent on circumstances. Colossians 1, what does Paul say? Now I rejoice, or I have joy in what I am suffering for you. This makes no sense when it comes to like the Marie Kondo way. This doesn't work for the hedonic treadmill. If joy is about feeling good, it's about pleasure, it's about minimizing pain. If that's true, there's no way Paul could say, I experience joy in my suffering. That's not possible. So joy must be something bigger than just feeling good. Hebrews 12. Jim mentioned this passage last night. We fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. What? If joy is about feeling good, if it's a spark of pleasure, this verse makes zero sense. The cross was an instrument of death, and a very painful death at that. It is the opposite of pleasure. It's literally the opposite of feeling good. And yet the writer of Hebrews says, Jesus has joy. He understands that there is joy on the other side. Not just like glory or victory. Yes, all of those things, but this is so strange. Jesus sees joy on the other side of this pain. The world wants you to run from pain and seek pleasure. God's invitation is to enter into pain and find joy. And to find joy because God, who rejoices over you, is near you in the pain. He's not left you alone. You know, it's really interesting. Jesus on the cross, you know, he says those words, Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani, right? He says, like, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's quoting an old psalm. Did you know that? And if you read the entire psalm, you realize, oh, the psalm doesn't end with abandonment. It ends with God's nearness and his victory. And most scholars think, most historians think, the Jewish rabbis would never quote just a verse or two. In fact, the whole concept of verses is really recent, just a few hundred years old. There were no verses back then. So if a rabbi would quote one part of like one or two lines of a psalm, they were nodding to everybody like, you know what this psalm says, right? It's almost as if Jesus, as he goes to the cross, he knows, like this right now feels like, God, where are you? Why have you abandoned me? But we know where this story goes. God's victory, his nearness, his closeness, leading to joy. So again, biblically speaking, joy is our state of being when we are connected to God. It's God's posture toward us. He rejoices over you. It's a result of the Spirit's work in our lives, again, as we are near God, as his Spirit moves in us and through us. And as Jim beautifully pointed out last night, it's an inner sort of steadiness that is based on the goodness of God and not on circumstances. Dallas Willard once described joy this way. He said, joy is not a passing sensation of pleasure, but a pervasive sense of well-being that is infused with hope because of the goodness of God. You know, I love that Jim said last night, you know, I think Jesus was playful and funny, because I totally agree. I was so glad when Jim said that. I was like, yes. Because we have this, most of us have this image of Jesus as this like glum, dour, sour, super moody, like middle-aged man. It came up earlier. Let me show you. These are some like famous paintings of Jesus. Okay, let me just ask you a question. Does that guy look like a good hang? Like if any of those dudes walked into Mount Hermon right now, and let's say he sat next to you right now, would you be like, oh, this guy, I'm gonna try to see if this guy wants to grab a donut afterwards, just like hang out, love to talk to this guy. No, if one of these dudes sat down next to you, you'd be like, who is this man? A little scary, quite intense. Like, hey man, ease up, lighten up, it's okay. It's okay, right? Like, look at these paintings, you guys. And I'm not saying Jesus was never like this. He absolutely was, right? Isaiah's prophecy, the suffering servant. Jesus had hard times, of course. But how come literally almost every painting in human history of Jesus, like 99.999%, how come they all depict him as like the worst hang ever? Like, I see paintings of Jesus, and some of them are really beautiful and profound, but I never think to myself, like, I'd love to sit and watch the game with that guy. Good dude, you know? Like, just get a hot dog, go to the Giants game, be so fun. Like, I never think that when I look at these paintings. And yet, when you read the Gospels, just think about this. Jewish rabbis were very uptight. They were like letter of the law. They teach the scriptures. They're really intense. Jesus is the only rabbi during his time. He gets invited to parties. And not only does he get invited, he doesn't get invited to like nice, fancy, like, hey, like we've got some hors d'oeuvres and some champagne. Those are not the parties he gets invited to. Not the hoity-toity stuff. Jesus gets invited to parties with criminals and hookers, like real parties, like pagan, very secular, not a good place for you nor your children to be. Like real parties, like in the modern age, think raves, you know what I mean? That's what Jesus gets invited to. Do you think that those people would have looked at this man and thought, you know what, dude? I bet he's a good hang. Let's invite him to our rager tonight. Look at that guy. This guy likes to rage. Let's invite him. No. They looked at Jesus and they were like, he's a rabbi, but he's like, I think he's into ragers, bro. Let's invite him, right? There was something about Jesus. Here's another thing. Children at the time, were considered not just second-class citizens, they were considered third-class citizens. Beneath the rung, there were men at the top in the ancient world, and then there were women, and then there were kids. Like today, we think about kids, we're like, oh, kids, we put them on pedestals, we love them, we celebrate them. In the ancient world at the time of Jesus, kids were like, keep the kids away. They don't like help us farm, they don't contribute financially. We just need to make sure they stay healthy so that they can grow strong enough to eventually contribute, and then we'll consider them valuable. That's how kids were treated. Nobody wanted to hang with kids, but kids are kids. This has been timeless forever, right? Kids don't know. There isn't like some cultural, kids are just kids. They want to play. And they are drawn to adults who would be willing to play. Have you ever read in the Bible that there were children who wanted to be near any adult? You have, but there's only one. And it's Jesus. There is not a single story in the Bible, not one, where a child wants to go and be with an adult, except Jesus. Now, if you are 7 years old and one of these dudes, like look at the top right corner, this old medieval Jesus, look at that guy. Imagine that dude rolled up into your town and he was like, If you're seven, my daughter's 8, my son's 5. If you're 8 or 5, do you think you'd look at this guy and think like, let's go play with him? No, you'd be like, that's a ghost. I'm gonna run. Freaky, I'm scared. You'd run away, right? But read the Gospels. What happens? Kids see Rabbi Jesus and they're like, that guy likes us. Let's go hang with that guy. These paintings are beautiful. they're helpful, they're incomplete. I agree completely with Jim. Jesus was full of joy. And not just like, I'm gonna grin and bear it joy. I'm gonna die on that cross for joy. Not just that kind of joy, actual playfulness. In fact, there's this book from the 70s by an old theologian named Elton Trueblood, great name, and it's called The Humor of Christ. And he's a brilliant man, was a brilliant man. He gets into the language and the context, and he starts extracting some historical contextual truths of Jesus' parables, and we miss it in the English. But did you know that if you were like a Greek expert and you could read the gospel stories and some of what Jesus says in the original language, couched in the original context, some of those things are like laugh out loud funny. One of the examples he points out is, when Jesus uses that metaphor and he says like, hey, like, dude, don't judge. Like, take the plank out of your own eye before you try to take the little speck of sawdust out of your brother's eye. You know that line? When we read it or we hear it taught in churches, we're like, yeah, super deep. Plank, sawdust, Jesus. That's how we hear it. Dude, when Jesus says it in the original language and context, it's like just a hilarious joke. It is so insanely ridiculous. And we miss it. Jesus is really funny. He's full of joy, like real, actual, pervasive, on the outside joy. In fact, Dallas Willard, again, he says one of the most outstanding features of Jesus' personality was precisely an abundance of joy. In John 14, we read that if you have seen Jesus, you have seen the Father. Jesus is a physical reflection, God in flesh, of God the Father. So if that's true, it means that God your Father is also full of joy. He probably likes a good joke, honestly. Willard again, he says we should, to begin with, think that God leads a very interesting life, that he is full of joy. Undoubtedly, he is the most joyous being in the universe. This is why when we are close to God, despite circumstances, we experience joy. Psalm 21, you make him or you make us glad with the joy of your presence. John 16, Jesus says, ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete. Romans 15, Paul says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy. John Ortberg says that joy is God's basic character. Joy is also his eternal destiny. And I love this line. God is the happiest being in the universe. Again, just want to bring us back to what Jim said last night. Your circumstances can't change, but your attitude can, and that makes all the difference. It echoes what we read in James chapter 1. Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of every kind, various kinds, any kind. That phrase, count it all joy, is a single word in the Greek. It's the Greek word hageomai. And in the ancient world, it's a weird word. It's a math word. Like math teachers would have used that word, hageomai. And essentially, what James is saying here is when you face trials in your life, do the math. That's what James is saying. When life is hard, just sit back, take a deep breath, and do the math. You've got circumstances, situations, hardships, struggles, unanswered prayers, anxieties, doubts, tensions. You've got all of this stuff, right? Plus the presence and the nearness of God. God's love and his grace in your life equals joy. That's the math. It doesn't matter the circumstances. Now, the circumstances matter. What I'm not saying is just minimize the reality of your life. No, no, no. Lean into it. It is what it is. Be as present as you can to the people you need to be present to, and be present with God in every situation, in every circumstance. But whatever the situation, whatever the circumstance, whatever is beyond your control, in your family, in your own heart and mind, in your workplace, in your church, wherever and whatever it might be, whatever the situation and circumstances, plus God's presence in your life, God's love for you, his grace toward you, his nearness to you in the midst of the pain always equals joy. Not pleasure, not good feelings, joy. That's what this verse means. Do the math. And here's the powerful thing. It's not like human math, because they just did the equation for you a couple of times. Anytime you add God's love, his grace, his presence, his nearness, what it will always equal is joy. It doesn't matter how big the number on the front end of the equation. It doesn't matter how massive the circumstance or situation, how painful the anxiety or uncertainty. Whatever it might be, if you live and lean into the reality of God's nearness, his presence, his love, his grace, the fact that God knows what it's like to lose a son, that God is near you. He feels your pain. He knows your pain. He understands your pain. He's not afraid of your pain. And he is closer to you than your very next breath. If that is the second part of the equation of your life, whatever the first part may be, the answer after the equal sign is always joy. Joy is always possible. I serve as the lead pastor at my church called Westgate, just 30, 40 minutes from here. But I've only served in that role for about a year and a half. It's new to me. But before me, the man who was our lead pastor, his name's Steve Clifford. He's a dear friend of Mount Hermon. He actually lived here for many years because he served on staff at a church in Santa Cruz. He's originally from Texas, and he served on staff at a church in Santa Cruz for many years before leading Westgate. And I worked for him for many years, and now he asked me to sort of transition into this role as he's stepped back. And he's one of the most, Mel and Ryan and some of our Westgate crew here would tell you this. If you spend 10 minutes with him, he's one of the most joyous people you will ever meet. He's like an old football coach from Texas. He laughs about everything, and he just wants to have a good time, always. He's awesome. He's a great hang. He doesn't look like any of those Jesus pictures. He's incredible. He's so full of joy, and he loves Jesus with his entire life. In front of the field house here at Mount Hermon, you probably passed by it this week. You know the benches on the sort of outer rim of the field? There is a bench there, and it's dedicated to Clay Clifford, who was Steve and Dana's adult son, who died in an accident about 10 years ago, tragically, while Steve was leading this growing, thriving church. I mean, there is not a worse situation that a human can go through than the loss of a child. Some of you have gone through that pain. There's nothing worse, right? Loss of a child or a grandchild. There is nothing worse. That is literal rock bottom. Like, I dare anybody in here to think of something worse than that. You can't. You can't. Every parent in here would say, 100 times out of 100, if I had a choice, I'd give my life for the sake of my child. There's nothing worse. So Steve and his wife Dana lose their son about 10 years ago, their adult son who was in his early 20s at the time. And he leaves the church. The elders give him a sabbatical. And nobody knows if he's going to come back. Nobody would have, the church was like, on paper, it was all like up and to the right at the time. It was like, oh my gosh, the Westgate train is just going, it's growing, and this is crazy. What do we do? God's up to something. And then this happens. I mean, everything in their life felt good for the most part at the time. It's like ministry's thriving, church is growing, our kids are doing well. You know, it was like everything's awesome. And then boom, a circumstance that he had zero control over in the worst circumstance imaginable. He loses his son. And he leaves for several months. The elders just give him time away, and they say, do whatever you need to do, and whatever you decide to do when you come back, we're for you. And what's the expectation at that point? Can anyone function after a loss like that? So everyone's expecting that he's just going to walk away and move away and figure out something else to do. He ends up coming back and continues leading our church for another decade. And he leads the church for another decade with this incredible limp. You know what I mean? And he talks about it often. Some of our team have heard him say this pretty recently, that grief, he says grief is like, he's realized grief is a little dog. And on most days now, it's a little dog that just kind of chases him around. And he says on some days, the dog is bigger. It's like, you know, it's more aggressive. It's like a pit bull. But he says on most days, it's just a small little dog. And then Steve said this to us recently. He said, recently, I have come to realize that there is a second dog. And that second dog that never leaves is the joy I find in the goodness of God. He's wondered to himself, I've talked to him about this one-on-one several times. He's wondered to himself, how have I made it this long, 10 plus years now since the loss of my son, with this little dog chasing me around all the time? And he said recently he has realized, there's always been two dogs. And the second dog is the goodness of God that has never left me. And he says that dog was there before Clay passed, and he's just beginning to realize that it's still there. And it enables him to live with joy in the midst of immense pain. This is possible for you. The joy of the Lord is closer than you think. And it is not contingent upon everything in your life feeling good. It is contingent only upon God's nearness to you. And God is near. If you would choose to draw close to him, you will discover that he has always been close to you. And joy is possible. Let's pray together, and we're going to sing and respond. Jesus, we take great confidence in the words of Nehemiah 8. The joy of the Lord is our strength. For those of us here today, God, with broken hearts and tired hands, we ask that your joy may be our strength. For those of us who are going to leave this mountain this afternoon with weary minds and anxious souls, may your joy be our strength. For those of us here wrestling with shame or guilt from our past, or fear and anxiety about the future, may the joy that you bring be our strength. We love you and we thank you. Pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.